Before we begin, I just wanted to say that this is a book. It's probably odd to hear an author say this, but it's a book I really wish I didn't write. We have a little bit of a story behind this book. So as you can see, the main author is Matthew Bentley. Matthew Bentley was a young man going to the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. And he had written a dissertation on the topic that we're talking about today. And I had actually had a chance to meet Matthew a long time ago. I guess it was 2008 that we met. Jackie Fear-Siegel was over here doing research for her book that came out, the White Man's Club, which is about the Carlisle Indian School, and I really highly recommend it. And Matthew had come over to do research on this dissertation on masculinity and football at the Carlisle Indian School. He had read my book on sports in indigenous boarding schools, and he actually had kind of a critique of it. So he said, you really haven't critically examined masculinity enough. You used the term masculinity, but you haven't really looked at it as carefully as I think you maybe should have. And I talked to him a little bit about it, and he was right. And so I was really impressed by his work. I was really impressed by what he was doing with it. He went back, and I ended up getting asked to be in this dissertation committee, even though I teach at Shippensburg University. So I went over and was part of the committee when he defended his dissertation, and which he passed with flying colors. And then came back here. Every so often I would hear from him to ask a letter, a recommendation, or something like that. And then in 2018, I heard the tragic news that he had come back from a trip to Germany, in which he was, I think, exhausted. And I hadn't known this before, but Matthew was a type 1 diabetic, and he had been fighting this his whole life, and he died in his sleep that night. So Jackie Fear-Siegel contacted me. She had been asked first, I think, to maybe finish his book, and then she contacted me. And at first I was in the middle of other projects, and I was thinking, wow, I don't know if I can really take this on. And then I thought, I'll apply for a sabbatical. And I applied for a sabbatical for the year 2020, 2021, which is a great year to take a sabbatical. And so I was able to write the book during that time. So this is Matthew's family that you're seeing here. His brother, Jonathan, his father, Phil. And I'm sorry, I don't know his mother's names. Well, thank you very much for all coming. I'm sorry about that. And I wanted to just see if you wanted to raise a glass to Matthew. It's as you may know, it's a time difference between here and the United Kingdom. It's 6 o'clock there, so I don't know if any of you brought anything. I will raise my water bottle. It's never a good idea to begin a talk when you're about to cry. But in any case, I'm going to begin with really what made Matthew's work unique, and what he taught me, and how that really ended up shaping what the book is like. And I ended up having to pick up the football, so to speak, and figure out some things from the people who had read it and made comments on it. And I was able to figure out quite a bit because Matthew's family had sent me all of his notes. I don't know about all of his notes, a lot of his notes, and his thumb drive. And so I was able to put some things together, some things that's just having to improvise. But together we were able to get this done. And it's a relief that we're able to do it. I just wish Matthew were the one here today presenting, and I was out there with all of you. So let me just share my slideshow here, and we can start. Hold on here. You don't want to see my slideshow in Lowell, Massachusetts. So I just want to ask Matthew's family, do you see on the screen the slideshow?
Yes.
Great, okay. This always takes a little bit when you're using a Mac. So this is the book that we wrote, The Imperial Gridiron. We do have some copies for sale that I can sell to you at the end of the talk today. There we go. All right. So you can see the cover up there and the book here. I just wanted to say that if you did want to buy a copy today, it's $65. Sorry about that. But the profits are all going to be contributed to the Cumberland County Historical Society. So it will be a little bit of a benefit to the Historical Society. All right. So I wanted to begin by talking about what this talk is about and the take that it has on football. So this is a Saturday, and Saturdays are, of course, college football days in the United States. A lot of people in this room probably might be wishing they were watching the Penn State-Maryland game right now. But I wanted to say that football is as much about ideas as it is about a physical game. We don't often think about something like football as being connected to ideas. I'm sure that if you were in the parking lot of State College right now, at Beaver Stadium, you would not be thinking about ideas very much. But there are actually ideas that are behind the game, and they're behind sort of the origins of the game. And a lot of what really is connected to the ideas relates to gender. Now, you may notice that all the people who play football in American football, as it's called here, as they call it in Great Britain, and we just call it football here, but all the people that play it are men, for the most part. I know that occasionally you'll see a female kicker playing high school ball, but almost all men play the game. And there are origins to that, and there's a reason for that. And this is where, Matthew really, this is sort of the linchpin of the book, and this is where he made his real contribution. He went back and looked at a book by Gail Betterman called Manliness in Civilization. And she's the one who pointed out that if you go back to the early 19th century, and particularly think, the way that people in the northeastern United States in particular, who were really dominant, in terms of shaping national identities and culture. The elites would have thought of manliness, so the ideal behavior that you'd have as a man, as being sort of a combination of two things. One was manhood was a combination of two things. One was manliness, and the other was masculinity. Manliness meant all of the properties of responsibility. So being sober, being pious, being religious, and being responsible. These were sort of the hallmarks of manliness. Masculinity would have been the physical aspects of what it meant to be a man, and the things that we often associate with that, like aggression, violence, and sexuality. So all these sorts of things would have been what we would associate with masculinity. And for the most part, the ideal manhood for an elite white man in New England, in Pennsylvania, and places like that, would have been somebody who tried to suppress masculinity as much as they could. It was believed that sort of an urge, a kind of animal-like aspect of human character, and that it should be something that you shouldn't elevate very much. And they believed that the people that did exhibit masculinity were people who they would have considered to be, quote-unquote, savages, people who they would have considered to be uncivilized. So obviously people of the African diaspora who were here and who were enslaved were understood to have been overly masculine, and the people who would have been sent to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which is an institution created in order to assimilate Indigenous Americans as much as possible into white Anglo-Protestant society. They would have been considered to have been too masculine. So one of the goals of the school was to teach them to be more manly. However, at the very same time that the Carlisle Indian School was formed, in the late 19th century, elite white men were actually going through a transformation. And they were deciding, sorry about this, I interrupt this for a moment so I can admit Jackie Fiercy. There we go. All right, welcome, Jackie. So during this very same time period, elite white men were embracing masculinity, especially young men. They were kind of breaking with the older generation, which happens a lot, right? Younger people break with the older generation. They want to do something new and different on their own. And one of the things that they were doing, and there are a lot of reasons for this, it's something a lot of historians, cultural historians debate, and we don't know exactly why. But it could be many of them were in the Civil War, and they kind of were inspired by their martial experiences on the battlefield. It could be that definitely, some of them would have been looking at newly emancipated African Americans and been a little bit worried about having these people that had suddenly earned the constitutional right to equal citizenship and to vote, that they're going to be among their fellow citizens in this country. And worried about what that equality might mean. Or they might have been, well, they certainly were worried, and we will talk about, not worried, but inspired by adventures overseas. Things like by the time we get to the end of the 1890s, the new American colonization in the Philippines, and adventures of the United States and Cuba and Latin America, places where people who were not considered to be white were living, and in addition to many other things too. But many people, there have been people that have wrongly called this a crisis in masculinity. It really isn't. It's more a younger generation throwing away this idea of manhood and elevated manliness over masculinity and deciding to embrace masculinity as part of that. And this isn't just something I'm kind of, this is something that may sound kind of strange to you, but really influential people were espousing this kind of thing. For example, a guy named G. Stanley Hall, who was a father of American psychoanalysis, and Teddy Roosevelt. And these are all people that Gail Betterman wrote about in her book. Gail Betterman's cover of her book is actually a painting by George Boros called Two Men of the Club. Did you notice what's going on in this? This is a painting that was done in 1909. Any sports historians know the significance of that date with boxing at all? Okay, so the year before, Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight fighter, won the heavyweight title in Australia, beating Tommy Burns. So you notice there's a white guy and a black guy fighting each other in a boxing ring, and who seems to be winning this fight? It's the African American guy, right? Yeah. So it shows you, it was a very controversial painting for its time. Burroughs was in some ways kind of celebrating maybe the sense of equality, but it also, speaks to maybe a little bit of anxiety about what racial equality might mean. And in the book, one of the things I brought in is I quoted at the end of the book that famous passage in The Great Gatsby, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, where Tom Buchanan, who was the white former football player from Yale, and he says, you ought to read this book called The Rise of the Colored Empires. And that's actually based on a real book by Northrop Stoddard that has almost the identical same title. So this is a very prominent set of ideas at the time. So let's talk about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And I'm going to begin with Richard Henry Pratt, who is both the founder of the school, probably the most important person in creating a 25 school off-reservation boarding school system in the United States. I'm kind of weird when I talk about Carlisle because I don't end up talking about Pratt probably as much as most people do. He obviously deserves a lot of attention for his role, but I think he's kind of a wormhole. You can kind of get stuck in the news. But he's a very important person. And he's kind of important to the whole story of Carlisle Indian School, Indian Industrial School football. Because if you know anything about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School at all, you probably know that they had a really good football team. So football, interestingly, was this game that was really rough. It was extremely violent, and it was really popular among elite white college kids in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And it was one that explicitly was talked about as proving their strength and mettle on the battlefield. So, when you, like Tom Buchanan, football star at Yale, that would have been very symbolic, of somebody who would have been in that class of people. And so what they're playing football for was to prove their masculinity. Carlisle Indian Industrial School students who were men wanted to play this game too, so they would organize their own games, and somebody got really horribly hurt in playing a game. And I'm not going to read from you the passage because I don't want to run too long, but Richard PRATT was really ambivalent about this. But and somebody broke their leg really horribly. He said, no, we're not playing football anymore. And he reports this in his memoir, Battlefield and Classroom. He says that these students came in to talk to him, and they said, we want you to install football again. And he says, okay, I'm going to do it under two conditions. Number one, that you never hit back when another player unfairly hits you. And he says, don't you know that if you hit back, they're going to say, that's the Indian. So you have to control yourself. And the second condition is that you beat the best teams in the country in 5 years. And they didn't do that. I should just let you know right now. They did not beat the best teams in the country in 5 years. So, but those were his two conditions. So it might strike you as kind of strange. I've been watching, by the way, a lot of Columbo lately for some reason. So at this point, Columbo would say something like, there's something that bothers me. And the thing that bothers me is, why would a guy that is dedicated to completely eradicating indigenous cultures and thinks of Native American men as being overly masculine allow them to play football, when football has become the symbol among college my students, you're not children. So college students of masculinity. That doesn't make any sense at all. But what he does is he decides, this can be, as I said, the first condition, it's the way that he can show to a public audience that his mission at the Carlisle Indian School, which he was absolutely sure was correct, and I saw that Jim Grenzer and Kate Thiemer are here, so they can confirm what I say here. He never thought that he was incorrect about anything, but he wanted to prove to the world that he was correct, because he needed to have federal funding, he needed to have supporters, he needed all this kind of stuff. So if he could do this on the public stage, that would be the best thing. And sure enough, in 1896, that opportunity came in a game against Yale. They were playing Yale. Yale was absolutely considered to be the best team in the country. In fact, the Yale, when we think about modern American football rules, they were created by the Yale coach, Walter Camp, and who had been a Yale student and a star player for Yale. So, and the largest stadium in the country was the Yale Bowl after we get into the 20th century. So Yale was a big deal. And they were losing to Yale by a touchdown. And a Carlisle player looked like he was sort of maybe grabbed in the backfield, but he was able to get away from it and scored a touchdown to tie the game toward the end of the game. And the referee called it back. And he said that it wasn't a touchdown. And actually the crowd, according to all news reports, was furious. And they were sort of rooting for Yale to be upset. And the referee actually said, okay, I'm wrong, but it was too late because he had blown the whistle already. So they didn't call the game back, and Carlisle ended up losing the game. And PRATT said that the players walked off the field in anger. And he says he got up in their faces and he said, don't do this. Get back out there and play, because even though you're going to lose in the scoreboard, you're going to win in people's hearts. Which, unfortunately, if you go to Wikipedia and check out the scores of Yale over time, it'll show this is a loss for Carlisle. So you don't see any heart next to it. So that didn't really work out. But according to him, they did that. Now, I've read a lot of news reports of this game, and I don't see anything ever that they threatened to walk off the game. And Pratt came down and talked to him. So if anybody goes on newspapers.com and can prove me wrong in that, go ahead. But I have not found anything. What I have found, though, and discovered, and this is something other people have written about, is that referee I was talking about was actually the Carlisle coach, Wild Bill Hickok. So at that time, the coaches actually refereed the game. And it was Carlisle's own coach who made the bad call, who was, not surprisingly, a graduate of Yale. So he was rooting against, for his alma mater against the team he was coaching. Eventually, though, in order probably to meet that second requirement, Richard Henry Pratt decides to hire the guy in the middle of the picture here, which is Glenn S. Pop Warner. And Warner was the coach from 1909 to 1903, right before Richard Henry Pratt himself left the school or was fired as its superintendent. And then he came back again in 1907 and coached the team through probably its glory years. So when you think about people like Jim Thorpe, Thorpe played under Pop Warner in 1910, 1911, 1912. So Warner was kind of a prototypical college football coach, sort of the model that a lot of other coaches have followed. He was rough. He was actually quite corrupt. He would bet on his team. He would pay his players. And he sort of was a person that was on the vanguard of when we think about college sports becoming professionalized. So he was really basically, had a lot of aspects of the team that ended up making it professionalized. And there are people that study college football and they have all these different categories of things that people do, like a training table, special training table, all these sorts of things. And that would have been something that that Warner was really into. And in fact, it's interesting I mentioned the training table because the emphasis on Carlisle men being manly was a problem for Warner because he said, my players are scrawny. They're not nourished very well, which is an indication of what conditions were like for most students at the school. And he said, they need to have some special accommodations. So they got their, own training table, their own diet, and the team became much more professionalized. So as I said, in 1904, Pratt ends up leaving. And he gets replaced by William MERCER, somebody a lot like Pratt. And in the question and answer, maybe some of you who know more about these relationships than I do can talk about this, but from what I understand, MERCER did not like Pratt very much. And one of the things about MERCER is that he was seeking to kind of curtail the ambitions of Pratt. So Pratt had a curriculum for the students that emphasized to some degree things like liberal arts studies, literature, writing, that sort of thing. And MERCER, kind of following with the new administration of Theodore Roosevelt at the time, was believing that indigenous people weren't capable of that they should be trained for manual trades, and that we should in some ways abandon Pratt's ideals. That's flicking on. All right. But it's under MERCER that we start to see the team begin to kind of make its comeback. He ends up rehiring Warner in 1907. Interestingly, though, one of the things that Pratt did on his way out was hire a Carlisle Indian School alum as its coach. And I'm forgetting who that is. Barb, can you help me out?
Bemis?
Bemis is later. Bemis Pierce comes later. But Bemis Pierce, one of the things I do want to point out, I will get to this, but Bemis Pierce coached Carlisle in 1906. And he sort of, there's a white coach that Mercer hired for the first part of 1905. The team rebelled against him. And so they brought Mercer, Pierce with another person who I forget, back, and then Pierce coached in 1907. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The person who was superintendent during the glory years of Carlisle was this guy here, Moses Friedman. Did I hear hisses out there? Friedman was really a terrible superintendent, and he even further curtailed the ambitions of someone like Pratt. He was not a military man; he was a public servant and kind of a bureaucrat, and was not a very effective leader. He was also was born Jewish. One of the things I won't really have time to get into, but he deserved a lot of criticism. He was a terrible superintendent, but he was also the victim of some pretty nasty anti-Semitism, even though he converted to Episcopalianism later on. Eventually, as you may know, Carlisle ends up playing pretty well. They rehire Warner. Here you can see that they're playing Dickinson College in 1910. This is one of their best seasons. So 1910, 1911, and 1912 are some of their best seasons. One thing I always like to point out, they're on defense, but Dickinson has an illegal blocker downfield. So they somehow got away with that. So in any case, Warner comes back, but the orientation of the team really changes. That emphasis on trying to promote manliness kind of evaporates in a lot of ways. And they really kind of realize people don't come out to watch a team play because they're really polite. You know, they come out to watch a team play because they win and they can compete. And so there's a lot of emphasis on getting them to win. So that's why they hire Pop Warner back. Pop Warner, in turn, ends up becoming almost like the ruler of the school, with almost no checks on his power. So when people criticize Friedman, he deserves it, but I think we should keep that in mind as well. And the way he did this was he would arrange football games against really important big teams like University of Pennsylvania. At that time, what we call the Ivy League teams were the best teams in the country, and there was the biggest teams were the Big Four, as they called them, informally. They weren't a conference, but they just called them the Big Four. And those were University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, Yale, and Harvard. When Pratt said beating the best teams in the country, that's who he probably was referring to. And in time, Carlisle would beat University of Pennsylvania, and they would beat Harvard on numerous occasions. They never beat Princeton or Yale. But Warner would arrange these games, and not only those games, but games against Wisconsin, games against Illinois, Minnesota, California, out on the West Coast, and with all these games, Carlisle got enormous gate receipts. And those are actually documented in ledgers. You can see how much money that Carlisle made. And they were in the thousands of dollars, which would have been quite a bit at that time. We're talking, adjusting for inflation, that would be 12 times what that amount of money would be today. Yet, Warner had sole control over the booster fund, where that money went. So he is the, and as far as, and once again, this is one of those things maybe some of you who know more about Carlisle can confirm, but I don't think anybody's really been able to see the ledgers of the booster fund. Can anybody tell me if those ledgers exist? Nobody knows how much. So Warner had total control over that. So he was completely exploiting these athletes and benefiting from that financially and in terms of his own fame. And how many people were here to see Dave Marinus a few weeks ago? So some of you might have been here. And he talked about Warner with regard to Jim Thorpe and Jim Thorpe's medals. And if you remember, Jim Thorpe's medals were taken away from him for playing professional baseball, really more like semi-professional, minor league baseball in North Carolina. And there's such strict amateur rules at the time in the Olympics that they didn't allow any kind of professionalism. And his medals were taken away. And Pop Warner really kind of turned on Jim Thorpe with that, really to save his own skin and save his own career. So Pop Warner goes on, he later goes on to the University of Pittsburgh after he leaves Carlisle, and I'll get to that in a second. But in any case, you see a real emphasis on that kind of professionalism. And you see a real emphasis on masculinity. So at this point, when you see newspaper coverage of Carlisle, you don't see many stories about how well behaved they were, which you do actually in earlier coverage. You see reports about what tough people these are. There actually is this photo spread of the players half naked that appears in, I believe it's New York Herald or New York Sun, one of the New York papers. It's a full page of photographs. So they're presented as these exotic, almost in animalistic kind of ways, and definitely people who are objectified, and they're treated literally as objects by Warner himself, who's benefiting from their play. And here you can see, by the way, Jim Thorpe. I had to include at least one picture of Warner and Thorpe, and that's one where you kind of see a little bit, I think, of Warner's character. He's somebody who himself never shied away. He embraced the whole masculine ideal. Players had mixed opinions about him, and the positive opinions about him were that he was a really good tactician. He really knew a lot about football. Let me just go a slide ahead here to show you something. He gets credit quite a bit for teaching the Carlisle students, for example, how to use the forward pass. The forward pass was first allowed in the rule book for college football in 1906. And the story goes that he was the one who really, took note of that and took advantage of that. How many of you have been paying attention to dates that I've been talking about here? Who was coach at Carlisle in 1906? Wasn't Pop Warner. It was Bemis Pierce. So it was Bemis Pierce that really actually used the forward pass first. Warner did come in that summer and work on it with the players in practice, but he wasn't the one to use it in a game. Warner, in addition to that, was somebody who beat his students. He sometimes beat them with a stick. He called them really vulgar names, which at the time would have been something really very, very insulting. He gambled on games. He paid players. So he was not a guy of great moral character. And especially when we think about him turning on Jim Thorpe, that was a time that really exposed that. In 1914, the students did something really interesting. Now, if you look at the history of Indian boarding schools around the country, the federal Indian boarding school system, pretty much if you looked at any one of them, you'll find a story of students rebelling against the school, probably more than one. Brenda Child, for example, writes about the Haskell Indian School, and at one point they burned the dorm down and tried to escape. There are lots of stories of students rebelling. And they did that at Carlisle. There was even a story of students throwing their shoes at Warner. But at Carlisle, they also did a different kind of rebellion, which is really kind of unusual. The rebellion that they did was a rebellion using the federal bureaucracy. And they formed a group, and they sent a petition to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to ask that they come and investigate life at Carlisle. And one of the things that they said was that conditions at Carlisle really weren't what they were propped up to be. That students at Carlisle regularly drank on campus, that they regularly engaged in sex when they weren't supposed to. Women who were going to Carlisle, I call them women, by the way, because by the time we get to the latter half of Carlisle's history, a lot of the people that are going to Carlisle are actually pretty old. So, a lot of these football players you're looking at were in their mid-20s, and they were still at Carlisle. So at an age when a lot of their peers might have been getting married. So when we think about them having sex, it isn't quite as corrupt as it might sound. They said, but they were using that, and they said, and they pointed out that the leaders of Carlisle were corrupt, and in fact they turned the tables on civilization. So while Carlisle was supposed to be civilizing them, they said, we're more civilized than the people who are running our school. And that prompted a congressional investigation. So there were three people, I think, that came to Carlisle. And then there was another petition that was made by the football team. And the football team came directly after Warner. And that's where all my facts about Warner and gambling on on the game and paying players and all that comes from the testimony that you heard there. Gus Welch, who was one of the big stars of the Carlisle team, was probably the sharpest in his critique of Warner. And they asked him, do you think that Warner, he goes on, he says he's a good football coach, he knows what he's doing with football, but he's a man of low moral character. And they said to him, okay, well, do you think he's dishonest? And he says just flat out, I do. There's a person who's written a great history of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. That's a dissertation that's never been published, named Genevieve Bell. Someone should get after her to get that published. It was written in the 90s, but it still is as timely today, except for some of the numbers need to be adjusted, but it's an amazing dissertation. And she speculates that perhaps the students rebelled because of the incident with Warner and Jim Thorpe, that they were angry about that. But in any case, the football team jumped on this bandwagon, and they decided they would join it. And it ended up that they had a huge impact. Now, I should say a few things here, that they embraced civilization a little too much. So, for example, one of their criticisms of Superintendent FRIEDMAN was that he was dominated by his wife because she was a suffragist. Another criticism of FRIEDMAN was that he was Jewish. And he claimed to be Christian, but he wasn't. And another criticism, another part of their critique was, African Americans from Carlisle are allowed to come onto campus sometimes, and the administration doesn't know about this, and that's the reason why several men have venereal disease. And that's where we get our liquor too. I think it's important in these sorts of things to look at the complexity of history and not to romanticize stuff too much. So they did embrace civilization a little too much, perhaps. But in any case, they did, and it ended up bringing FRIEDMAN down. So FRIEDMAN was somebody who actually, when he joined as Carlisle superintendent, was being talked about as the next commissioner of Indian Affairs. He left Carlisle, and really almost nobody knows what happened to him much after that. I think he went to Los Alamos, New Mexico, I think, for a while, and then we kind of lose track of him. So he's kind of destroyed. Another person who comes off very poorly in these hearings is the band director, Claude Stauffer, who beat a student, and a really, really ugly incident that we recount here. And he's gone. Pop Warner keeps his job. And the reason why is he was paid entirely from this athletic fund. The athletic fund he had complete control over. That was not, he was not on a government salary. So he stays on for another year, but he finds it pretty untenable. He leaves in 1915, goes to the University of Pittsburgh, where he coaches for a short while, and then goes on to Stanford University. Basically he kind of embraces his past eventually, and uses this experience at Carlisle as part of a mystique that he built around himself. He writes a series of articles about his coaching experiences at Carlisle, dressing up in a regalia at one point in the picture that's in this series of 3 articles. And he even is the reason why the Stanford football team was called the quote-unquote Indians, which a name that they took away in 1971. And one of the things I just want to say is, the outcome, eventually the school, just a few years later, in the middle of World War I, closes, in large part because the government needed to have hospital space for wounded soldiers coming back from Europe, and the scandal had really tarnished Carlisle's reputation. So the football team had a great deal to do with both building up the school and with tearing it down. But in terms of tearing it down, one of the unfortunate things is you see over time that almost the football players and the students get equated with this corruption at the school more than the people who are leading the school, who essentially were the ones who the students originally wanted to indict. So the only person really to go for trial was FRIEDMAN, and his assistant, who is a graduate of the school, I believe, and he went before a grand jury and basically pleaded guilty, went before a grand jury, testified before FRIEDMAN. FRIEDMAN was indicted, goes up before a federal trial, gets acquitted, and his assistant goes to the penitentiary. So he never really faced consequences for anything that happened at Carlisle either. So that's kind of the story, but I do want to end by saying that over time, Carlisle football did become a source of Indigenous pride for a lot of people who went to the schools. A lot of other students at boarding schools other than Carlisle kind of picked up sports and football, and it became a really important part of their lives. And inspired in some ways by the success that Carlisle ended up achieving on the football field, which should be celebrated. They were really good football players. They had a really good football team. So that ends up becoming, in some ways, a really, really important legacy of the Carlisle football team. So with having said all that, I will entertain questions, and hopefully we can see everybody else on the board from England.